Yeah, so today we're looking at the short film Mary by Fatima Mawas. It's a 6-minute film, sort of showing the interaction between a young, blonde, presumably Christian child and a Muslim neighbor wearing a hijab that the child associates with the Virgin Mary robes.
Why did you choose this particular artifact?
Yeah, I guess, you obviously found it on Colourfest, which has a lot to do with sort of the diaspora and migrant experience. But we chose it obviously because it deals with a direct sort of interaction between people of diverse backgrounds and covering kind of an interesting intersection of them.
And it's also quite an interesting take on a child's sort of culture shock of being exposed to something that she hasn't been exposed to before, and so she quickly links it to the first thing that she can think of.
Yeah, definitely. Like a touchstone that's familiar to her that has some correlation with what she's seeing.
Yeah. So what or who does it represent? So as you said, there's the blonde white girl who
Yeah,
is presumably Christian, seeing as she makes the connection between the woman and the Virgin Mary.
yeah.
Um, and then
And
there's
also
the
has those, sorry to interrupt,
yeah,
has those items available to her quite readily as well. Says they're
yeah.
like sort of in her house.
And then the other character that we see sort of focused on is the Muslim woman who's wearing the hijab, and she's wearing uh, blue robes on top of her clothes,
Yeah.
which is the main thing that the young girl links to the Virgin Mary. Um, and so, what does it represent? Uh,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, I think pretty clearly a sort of a discussion on the pretty relevant and
Uh,
prevalent sort of context in today's society of, religious background and assumption of background depending on that.
yeah, and there's also the sort of as we discussed before, is the impact of ignorance and the lack of experience in diverse communities, and how they affect children's interpretations of their how they experience the world.
Yeah.
As what values, assumptions, or stereotypes does the artifact represent? So I'll go first here.
Yeah.
So we've said that it represents the innocent way in which children make assumptions about the world around them according to their immediate environment. And then it's also it shows the value of exposing the kids to um, diversity in modern culture, and and how that helps their ability to navigate the modern world, which is quite a diverse community.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in the video, sort of clearly a lack of understanding in the sort of kid developed by, lack of exposure in her own life is what instigates the whole interaction, the
Yeah,
spying and sneaking and trying to sort of present this person with her ideas.
yeah. And then we've also said that it shows ignorance versus intolerance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we discussed how uh, so it's all right for her to be ignorant at that age because of the fact that it's something that she's never been exposed to before. Um, but as she gets older, if she doesn't have an opportunity to experience that, that ignorance could become intolerance later on in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's a very different context to approach things from when you're a kid, sort of that naive um, innocence compared to an informed ignorance.
Yeah, and it is our responsibility to address that ignorance um, as educators, obviously.
Definitely, and providing sort of diverse experiences early as we can, and allowing for those experiences means that they've got a basis later on.
Yep. And so, what ethical issues does it raise? I'll let you
Um,
take this one.
yeah, again, so we sort of already covered a little bit of that in the idea of ignorance and intolerance, sort of how ignorance can, I guess, develop into intolerance in a sense, like the way she approaches it in a kid context is different from how it would be approached in an adult situation.
Yep. And just adding to that, there's also um, it, it 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 shows the difference between uh, sort of when a child is ignorant, it's it's innocent because they just don't know any better. However, with adults, they should know better. They should
Yeah,
know, um, and therefore it's no longer an innocent thing. Uh, it's just ignorance.
exactly. Once there's that informed background, there's no excuse really for that ignorance, and it becomes a yeah, matter of then becoming about bias and yeah.
Yeah. Next question was, what form or aspect of diversity do you think it represents? Uh,
Yeah, I think it's pretty prevalent lately to be discussing sort of issues surrounding people's presumptions about Muslim people and beliefs, and having people as neighbours with differing beliefs becomes a sort of hot topic in a lot of political discussion, I guess, which is
yeah,
unfortunately prevalent, but it still speaks to being more informed and diverse than we have been in the past.
yeah,
I think you were talking previously about the cultures that were previously immigrating weren't as diverse in their practices as they are now, and that can pose sort of that more obvious
yeah.
difference in
So,
culture.
the examples I was giving are uh, there's a lot of Greek and Italian communities here in Australia, and their culture isn't as different from the traditional Australian culture as, for example, cultures from the Middle East or from Asia or South Asia. Um, and so that's a bit more of a culture shock for kids. But even back when a lot of Europeans were migrating here to Australia, even then there was a bit of a culture shock.
Yeah,
Um,
of course.
um, yes, but at the same time, uh, Australia was not as diverse then as it is now,
Yeah,
and it is only becoming more diverse.
yeah.
Uh, and so how does it uh, how does it do this? Um, how does the video represent these aspects of diversity?
Yeah, it's interesting the way it's very there's no dialogue obviously in the video to sort of um, clearly say anything, but it still visualizes that sort of childlike interest in new information, how it sort of becomes an obsession of hers, sort of a habit to go and drop something off.
Yep, and I think it also it paints a picture for you without needing to describe it outright.
Yeah, absolutely.
It allows you to um, just like the girl in the video, you will make assumptions because of the fact that you are not explicitly told anything. Um, and that's why it's so interesting for us as adults who have um, sort of come into contact with Christian religions, regardless of the fact of whether or not we are Christian ourselves. Um, we do make assumptions when watching this, and the way that it plays on those assumptions is what um, sort of makes the video interesting and kind of funny at the end, because the, she thinks that the woman is uh, Mary. But I mean, for myself, the first time I watched it, I was thinking that the child might have an issue with having Muslim neighbors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, I definitely think it sort of expects a little bit of that, particularly in older people watching it who may have that, um, I guess, experience with those sort of behaviors within discussion about, diversity. The people who don't appreciate it and don't want to acknowledge it or embrace it at all. So it does sort of the suspicious music and the sort of sneakiness of the kid really play into this little bit of an assumption about the nature behind it,
yeah,
and then to find it's kind of a nice, just sweet offering in the end.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the music really does make it seem very ominous.
Yeah, it's very ominous. It's a little off-putting, but it's I think it really adds to the kind of sweet moment at the end.
What feelings does speaking about this artifact invoke in you, and why? So I'll let you start.
Yeah, I guess just following on from that, just kind of encouraged by, I think, the sweetness of it. Sort of, it's a nice way of approaching a topic that can be a bit hard to encounter comfortably for some people. I certainly feel not informed enough a lot of the time to be speaking about certain things like that. So
I mean, for me, it is it's very cute and it's very sweet, and it's a lot of discussion about things such as this, about race and cultures and them being introduced into Australia and anywhere else around the world, is usually met with sort of the people push back against it. Whereas there's this girl who this little girl is just she is jumping to conclusions, but at the same time she's putting this woman that she's never seen before into uh, into her world in the best way that she knows how, which is she sees her, she thinks she's the Virgin Mary, and she's like, that's what she is, and she's excited about it. She's
yeah,
not.
and wants to sort of give her items that show that she recognizes her, and
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. She's happy to have this person nearby, even though she doesn't quite understand who she is. It doesn't matter to her.
Yeah.
So next question was, does it make you feel uncomfortable, and why? I think we both said that the music is quite off-putting at first,
Yeah.
and the girl's behavior, along with the music, I feel like the music does sort of paint a picture as well in your mind, and I feel like it's intentional so that you get that juxtaposition at the end where it's like it's not that sinister, but when the girl's sneaking around and her sort of obsessive behavior is a little bit off-putting,
Yeah.
but it's sort of a build up to the end so that you feel that relief when you realize that it's not sinister. It's actually quite cute. This little girl is giving this woman these sort of little offerings.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think without the music, it would be a really different story. It would be very much up to the person themselves to sort of expect what's going to happen,
Yeah.
and depending sort of on then your experiences in diversity, it's sort of easy to assume that you could not get much of a provocative thought from it. I suppose you'd be like, oh yeah, that was just a nice, sweet story.
Yeah, and yeah, it's definitely It's a sweet story about a little girl with music that's a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Um, so thinking as a teacher, how might you use this artifact with your students, or perhaps for your professional development?
Um, yeah, I thought it was interesting when we were first discussing this how we sort of thought about the religious context of the kids if it was being used in a classroom. So, saying that it could potentially work in Christian schools where there would be a touchstone for sort of knowing what the Virgin Mary looks like, that the blue is very, you know,
Yeah, it,
often used in her iconography. But then outside of that, kids might not quite get that connection. So it might not be as easy to get that idea across.
yeah, I, it definitely, in order to understand it, you definitely need prior understanding of who the Virgin Mary is. Um, in much the same way that this young girl doesn't actually know
Yeah.
that this woman is not the Virgin Mary,
Yeah.
and that's because she does not have that previous knowledge.
Yeah.
Um, so yes, I definitely agree that this is, if it were to be used for teaching students, it would definitely either require a bit of explanation, or it would need to be given to students who are both I don't want to say Christian students, but students who have an understanding of the Virgin Mary.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously for different people of different ages, this is going to affect them differently.
Yeah.
So for quite young kids, they're going to they might not put it together as quickly as we did as adults. Um, but at the same time, some of them might make the same mistake and think that she is the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And sort of some kids might see the original image and think, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.